Hello, everyone. My name is Georgine, and I'm 21 years old. My story begins a couple years back when I was 16. It was just me and my mother, as my father was nowhere in the picture when I was growing up. My mother did her best to make ends meet, but it was no secret that we were struggling just to scrape by every month. I had even gotten a job during the times I wasn't at school to try and help her pay some of the bills. It was really stressful, and I know it was a really hard time for her as well. I remember waking up once, feeling as if my skin was crawling with a sensation that was going through my body. I turned on my small bedside lamp, trying to figure out what the problem was. I pulled my raggedy blanket off myself and promptly began to shriek. There were bugs just crawling over me in an excessive number that would make anyone feel sick. I had jumped to my feet and began frantically swiping them off of myself. I rushed down the hallway and into my bathroom, turning on our old shower and hopping in with my clothes still on. I felt so disgusted with our living conditions that night, and I sobbed quietly in the cold downpour of water from the shower. Going to school wasn't easy either, as everyone pretty much knew that I was in a bad situation at home. My clothes were by no means nice, usually hand-me-downs that were stretched out or torn and faded. I was made fun of a lot, but I didn't necessarily care too much. No one physically put their hands on me, just a lot of rude remarks and snide comments. Words don't really bother me though, and after all the stuff I dealt with just to keep myself afloat every day, I barely even noticed after a while. Lunchtime was always rough on school days, however, even without the name-calling and remarks. More often than not, I didn't get to eat lunch. I couldn't afford what the school offered, as all my money went toward bills and house repairs. It was rare that there was something at home that we could spare for me to bring to lunch. That was the hardest part of my day, being in a cafeteria, watching everyone chat with their friends and eat. I wondered if they knew how much they were taking the things they had for granted. Anyone could wind up in my position with just a couple of bad choices or a few unfortunate events in a row. I wouldn't wish this on anyone, not even the people that constantly taunted me. One day, I was walking home from school. It seemed like any other mundane afternoon, but I noticed something odd as I approached my house. There was an unfamiliar red car parked in front of our house. We didn't tend to have guests over, so I had no idea who it could possibly be. As I walked through my front lawn, I could hear the distant sound of my mother weeping. It was coming from within the house, and I suddenly felt much more panic. I raced through the grass into my front door, quickly throwing it open. She was sitting on the couch, openly crying, with two men looming over her. These were rather large men, quite bulky and scary-looking in my opinion. I audibly gasped at the sight, intimidated as the men turned to stare at me. Before I could even think to run, they were on me. One of them grabbed me by both of my wrists, while the other held my legs as they lifted me with ease. I was struggling and trying to twist out of their hold, but it was iron tight, and there was no way I was going to escape them. I don't know what they wanted with me, but I could feel myself trembling as they settled me in the car. They were rather gentle as they did, surprising, considering how firmly they had been holding me. I was a trembling mess as they got in the front seats and began to drive. I couldn't open the back doors, and I assumed they had turned on the child's safety locks as a precaution. I was frantically looking out of the windows, trying to distinguish any sort of landmark or familiar location. I tried to shout at them to let me go, that this was kidnapping, that I'd call the police. They didn't even bat an eye or turn to look back at me. Either they didn't believe me, or they couldn't care less if I actually went through with my threat. They probably assumed I was too poor to afford a cell phone. They drove and drove and drove for what felt like a lifetime. The afternoon had turned to sunset as we drove, and I had no idea where we were anymore. Nothing looked familiar, and I had never been this far away from my house before. I was feeling more and more dread the further we got, certain that they were taking me somewhere to bump me off. Why did they have to choose me? Why did their attention turn from my mother to me when I entered the house? I was too young to die, and I knew if they tried, that I wouldn't go down without a fight. The car suddenly lurched to a stop, right in front of a rather quaint house. The place was at least 3 times the size of my little run-down house, with a nice and well-taken-care-of garden surrounding it. It was obviously owned by someone pretty well off, as it looked like the lawn and landscaping were immaculate. I would have admired it more if I wasn't so busy shaking as the men got out of the car. I scooted all the way to the other side of the car as the men opened the door to the car. But before I could bolt out of the seat, a woman opened the front door of the home. She rushed down through the garden toward the car, and I could see faint trails of tears on her face. "Oh, my child, my sweet baby girl," she had wept as she stopped between the 2 men standing guard. I went from terrified to confused with those words. "After all these years, you're finally here," she had wept as I cautiously stepped out of the car. I looked over her a moment, not finding anything familiar about her or recalling ever seeing her. She was a pretty woman, probably around the same age as my mom, if not a bit younger. She had a beautiful little sundress on, and a gorgeous necklace that glimmered with the late sun shining on it. I finally asked her what she was talking about, and who was she. "Georgia, I'm your mother, sweet girl," she beamed through her tears. I felt my brain stop working for a second, and the men had me by either arm and were soon escorting me inside. I just let them, too stunned to really fight them at this point. The home was cozy and nicely decorated, quite the contrast to my house. I sat on the couch, and this woman settled beside me and grabbed my hand in both of hers. She and the 2 men took turns explaining to me her story. I wasn't convinced at first that they were telling the truth, but the more I listened, the more I began to understand. It turns out she was my biological mother. She explained that the woman I currently lived with, who I thought was my mother, had made a deal with my actual mother. My biological mother had wanted me to grow up humbly, so I wouldn't be vain and spoiled by a wealthy upbringing. After I had shown that I was capable of being a hard-working and gentle girl, the woman who had took me in refused to give me back to my real mother. She explained that was why the men had been sent over to finally collect me after all this time. These men were my biological mother's bodyguards. My first thought was that this was a prank, some elaborate hoax for a good laugh. It was too unreal, unbelievable for me to think it anything else. This woman, who was my apparent mother that loved me, allowed me to live in squalor. I had bugs crawl on me at night when I was sleeping. I sacrificed all my time to pay for bills for a woman who wasn't even related to me. I lived in fear of our old, rusty house blowing over at the sign of a stiff wind, and she was up here sleeping cozily in a near mansion. My life, my childhood and family, all of it had been a fabricated lie to make sure I didn't grow up a brat. I spent the night crying in that lovely house, in a nice warm bed in my own room. My real mother wasn't even there to comfort me after all of that. The next morning, I was feeling a bit better and was starting to adjust to the idea. When I came down for breakfast, my mother casually said that if I wanted to start up college, that I was more than free to start attending. I was soon weeping again from gratitude, realizing this sweet woman would fund my education. I had explained to her the kind of living I had come from, how such a grand gesture meant the world to me. She seemed appalled when I explained to her the spiders and cockroaches I dealt with. She started weeping herself as I continued, seeming to realize the kind of environment she had willingly left me in. She swore to me that she had no idea it was that bad, that she had believed the woman was lower middle class. Apparently, the woman I had been living with had lied to my mother about being at the poverty level, afraid she wouldn't be given me. I felt a little less bitter when I saw the genuine regret on my real mother's face. She hadn't left me in poor conditions on purpose, and she had definitely meant well. Still, there was a lot of coldness I felt toward her for just giving me up like that. It was hard to just outright forgive her after everything I had been through. It was hard for me to even believe this woman could love me if she could so easily just toss me to another woman. She had then promised to me that she would make it up to me. I wasn't interested in having my love bought, however. and promptly told her she couldn't bribe me. She denied the idea, saying she wanted nothing but my time. I felt she had no right asking, since she had wasted so many of my years not being there. But I was willing to try. She took me out some days for lunch or dinner, which was a newer experience for me. Even little cheap cafes were mind-blowing to me, as I'd always just tried to eat whatever we had at home. I was very accustomed to bread sandwiches. I could see the lingering sadness on her face when I was fascinated with even the most mundane of necessities, like warm water. My heart did go out to her for showing such remorse. Things were going great after that, and I was really starting to feel like everything was going my way for once. Until I met a certain boy. His name was Michael, and I was instantly in love. We got together soon after meeting, and I thought this was a feeling that I'd cherish forever with him. My mother had been thrilled and was excited to meet Michael when I brought him over. I was feeling more love than I ever had my entire childhood. I didn't realize at the time, though, that Michael didn't really love me. Once, when I was coming home to my mother's villa, I caught him with another woman. He let himself into my own home with another woman. How dare he cheat on me in my own home? I swiftly kicked them both out and broke up with him. I was devastated, but this time I had my mother around to dry my tears and tell me how stupid boys were. She made everything better and helped me to move on. I'm happy to say that I now live in my biological mother's villa with my actual mom. I never have to worry about foreclosure or waking up to cockroaches ever again. My mother recently told me that she plans to bring her boyfriend home for me to meet. She said he will eventually become my stepfather, which I am both anxious and excited about. I've never had a father before, but I'm sure we will be able to connect. I've honestly never been so happy.